Well, good evening. It is good to see everyone this evening. I know it's been a couple weeks for this too, since we had our meal fairly recently, but we are going to be continuing our look at background history of the Bible and Bible times, and in particular, we're looking now not so much at the background of an active part of the Bible, but something that led up to, ultimately, the New Testament. If you remember last time, we looked at kind of the beginning of what we're going to look at in more detail tonight. Basically, what you have is a kingdom, empire, whatever you want to call it, in charge of the area of Israel. This is after Alexander the Great. This kingdom is called the Seleucid Empire, or sometimes it's basically called the Syrian Empire in this weird way, but for our intents and purposes, we're going to call it the Seleucid Empire. This was one of the splinter empires after Alexander, and for a while they treated the Jews pretty well. They allowed them to practice their religion, to live according to their law, but at the same time, all of these different Greek splinter kingdoms or successor kingdoms were not necessarily pressuring, but were encouraging the spread of Greek culture, of Greek religion, of Greek practices. And eventually you get to the gentleman we talked about fairly extensively last time, Antiochus IV. He had in his mind that he was going to defeat one of the other successor kingdoms, the one that controlled Egypt, which we call the Ptolemaic kingdom. But he was frustrated in that attempt, incidentally, by the Romans. And so with a giant army with nowhere to attack, he comes back and is annoyed at the Jews for being so backwards, especially with some of the politics that have been involved. And so he begins forcing the Jews to conform to Greek practices, forbidding them from things like practicing the law in various ways. He even goes into the temple itself and erects a statue of Zeus and sacrifices a pig on the altar to Zeus. But as we got to the end of our discussion last time, and we asked the question, what happens when you try and force your culture on others? Well, if you push too hard, you're going to cause something to snap. And that's exactly what happened in that small little village called Modin. There was a man, a priest, I believe, as his description anyway, named Mattathias. And he was asked by a Seleucid official to sacrifice an offering to Zeus as a display of the loyalty of this particular small farming village. And he refuses. Not only does he refuse, but he kills one of the other Jews who is going to do it, and he kills the Seleucid official as well. And so that was the spark that begins what will eventually come into a full-on revolt. However, as we talked about last time, Mattathias is an old man. He is not equipped, he is not able to sustain the leadership of a force in a full-blown revolt, a full-blown revolution. So he's going to pass that mantle on to one of his sons. So we're going to talk this evening about what I chose to call the glory of the Maccabees. Now, I have no idea, just full disclosure, who the guy is in this particular picture, who this statue is supposed to be of. Again, remember, a lot of times I have to rely on free pictures. The idea I want us to have with this image is the idea of memorializing heroes. Because we all do that, right? And by we all, I mean human beings. Every culture, every nation, every civilization, we remember, we immortalize our heroes. So I want us to think, as we are telling the story of the Maccabean revolt tonight, and by the way, again, questions, comments, always welcome as we're going through these things. I want us to consider a different question than the one we considered last time. We considered the idea of what happens when you try and force culture on someone. I want us to consider a different question. Something very personal to us, in a sense. What effect has the American Revolution had on our society even to this day? Now, I'm not looking for the answers right now, but let me clarify the question, and I just want this to be in the back of our minds as we move forward this evening. What effect has the American Revolution had? I'm not talking about, well, the nation exists because of the American Revolution. I'm not talking about that kind of effect. I'm talking about societally, culturally, behaviorally. For example, when I say the phrase the Founding Fathers, do you know what I'm talking about? There is not even any question in our minds, right, that we know who we're talking about. We're talking about people like Franklin and Jefferson and Washington. We know exactly what we're talking about. Whenever we even talk about phrases like freedom or liberty, well, our minds probably go back to things like our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence. If I were to start off a sentence by saying something like, the beginning of one of these documents, well, and it's just escaped my mind. I know the beginning of both of them, but it's escaped my mind. But if I were to start in on that, right? We the people of the United States, there we go. You know what that's from. You know what that's a reference to. That's the direction I want us to take this question. So let's keep that in the back of our minds as we begin to think about these ideas tonight. We said Mattathias is an old man. He is not able to carry on to be the leader of a revolt on his own. So he appoints one of his sons to take on that job. Because as soon as they kill a Seleucid official, well, what do you think is going to happen? Well, more are going to come for him, right? Now they're outlaws. But this was the spark necessary to start a flame, because there are a whole lot of Jews that are not happy with what's going on. And in fact, there are a whole lot of Jews that are being put to death because of what's going on. That doesn't last for very long before you get some pushback. And this is promising, anyway, at this point, to be the pushback that they need. So Mattathias appoints one of his sons. Interestingly enough, it is not his firstborn son. It is one of his middle sons. His name, in Greek anyway, is Judas. In Hebrew, that would be Judah, as we're familiar with perhaps the tribe of Judah. But in Greek, and that was how he was most commonly known, because remember, they're fighting Greeks, his name is Judas. And eventually, he earned a title. That's not actually his surname or last name, as we might think of it. This is a title that he was given because of what he did. You might be able to make it out. So this in Greek is Judas, or Eudes. They don't actually have a J in Greek. So this is Eudes. This is Maccabees. Maccabeus means hammer. So basically, he was known as Judas the Hammer. Now, why do you think someone would be named a hammer? Anybody watch WWE? Right? Why do you use those kinds of titles? Well, because he brings the hammer down on people, right? That's the idea here. He is named the Hammer because he was a very successful leader of this revolt. This is a picture. Certainly it's not a picture that was taken during the Maccabean revolt. This is a picture actually that was taken during World War I. But it's a picture taken on kind of the outskirts of some of the Judean foothills in the territory of Palestine or Israel, however you want to refer to it nowadays. You notice something about this hill country? It's interesting. We actually have, I believe these are British troops here on horseback. How much trouble are they going to have if they want to go up into those hills on horseback? Anyone who's ever ridden a horse before, and I think that's most of the people in this room, that doesn't go very well once you start getting on uneven ground, especially, and I hope nobody in this room has had to do this, but especially if you want to fight on horseback. Uneven ground does not do well. Horses can trip and break things really easily in uneven terrain, or in forested terrain, or take your pick, right? They need flat plains, they need flat grassland to be able to operate adequately. So if you are a ragtag bunch of rebels and you are in the area of Judea, where are you going to go? Well, you're not going to be able to face an army in the field. You don't have the numbers, you don't have the equipment, you don't have any of that. So you're going to hide in the hill country where horses can't catch up to you, and where heavy infantry is going to have trouble keeping up with you speed-wise. So you got the best of both worlds. You're faster than the heavy infantry that can beat you in a one-on-one combat, so you just run away from them. And horses can't chase you down because you're in the hill country. They can't operate very well in hill country. So it's the perfect terrain. That's how Judas Maccabeus and the Jews who were with him, more and more flocking every day to his banner after this incident at Modin, that's how he waged the majority of this war. Any wars in our own history come to mind that might resemble this, tactically speaking? What wars do we have where you have a small group of people that have to hide in favorable terrain because they're outnumbered and outgunned? There's two that actually are coming to mind. Anybody want to take a guess? Okay, three. Let's take three. Okay. Afghanistan is a very good one. Because you have similar terrain in many cases, you have hill country, mountains, and so forth. That's where a lot of the organizations that were, terrorist organizations and things like that, that's where a lot of them would make their camps. Why? Because even with all the modern technology we have now, that kind of terrain still makes it really difficult. And so you have this kind of guerrilla fight that took place in places like Afghanistan, Iraq. What else? What other wars were fought, at least partially in this way, in our history? Do what? Korea and Vietnam. I'm thinking in particular of Vietnam, maybe just because it gets more of the we are seeing or are given more of kind of the insights into how that went with the guerrilla warfare specifically. But Korea also saw its share of this as well. What do you have when Americans go into a place like Vietnam and the enemy very often, you can't see them, they're hiding in difficult terrain. In the case of Vietnam, it was the jungle, not hill country per se, but they're hiding in very difficult terrain. They ambush you constantly. You don't really know who the enemy is. There are very rarely any kind of pitched battles, meaning battles where two large groups of people just fight in open terrain. Usually this is very much a guerrilla warfare. What happens in that kind of scenario? Well, a lot of different things happen. Number one, you don't need as many troops if you're the ones fighting guerrilla style. Number two, you can very quickly demoralize the invaders who are coming in. And I don't mean to be political and calling the Americans the invaders, but in a very real sense, they were invading the jungle territory, right? So you have this dynamic that, honestly, although we personally may not have had a whole lot of experience with it, most of us are familiar with this type of fighting. The other war I was going to throw out there would actually be the American Revolution itself. A lot of times, and this is something that's interesting, it's not talked about a lot, most battles that were like big, hey, I'm going to take my army against your army, we're going to fight with big, massive armies, most battles like that happened in the American Revolution, we got stomped. You know why we got stomped? Because we weren't a professional army. Not really. We were outmanned, we were outgunned. The British was the best army in the world. They were well trained. Guess how we won most of our victories? Well, it was a combination of good tactical advantages just in movement of troops, but also, especially in the South and the Carolinas in particular, it was through guerrilla warfare. We would have bands of militia, of American militia, that would raid supply trains, raid small groups of British forces, and then melt back into the swamps and forests and so forth of the Carolinas before the British could retaliate. Well, that's the kind of warfare that Judas Maccabeus chooses to use on the Seleucids. And guess what? It worked really, really well. Now, to understand some of the significance of this for Jews, we need to think about another aspect of this. Can you think of someone in Jewish history who used this kind of warfare to his advantage? Who else had a band of loyal soldiers fighting with him in the hill country of Palestine for years? David. You see, when we read about David, and I think this is fair to say as a general rule for hate to say Americans, but just the people that I know, right, that read the Bible, usually we think of David as King David, we think of David as, the shepherd or the psalmist or all these kind of things. But there was a significant portion of David's life where this is not his life at all. He is, for all intents and purposes, a rebel chieftain with a bunch of rebels hiding in the hills. Now, let me qualify that, of course. Rebel in the sense that he's on the run from the king, not in the sense that he is attacking other Jews or innocents or trying to kill King Saul. We see very explicitly that David would not do such a thing as kill the Lord's anointed, even though he has multiple opportunities. But in terms of how he conducted himself and how he fought, David was a guerrilla warrior. So there is precedent for this type of fighting, even in the legends, and I don't mean legends in the sense that this didn't actually happen with David, but David was made into a very celebrated, heroic, legendary figure in the sense that he was raised up in the imagination of the Jews. In other words, kind of like in the same way that Washington or Jefferson or people like that have been raised up to kind of legendary status, not in the sense they didn't exist or didn't do the things that we talk about, but in the sense that that's kind of how they're revered from a cultural standpoint. Well, that's how David was. In part, not just because of his kingship, but we got to remember the Jews knew about that other part of his life as well. And now, lo and behold, we have a Jew at a time of oppression. Remember, when David is pulling these kinds of tactics during his day, they're being oppressed by the Philistines. Well, now they're being oppressed by the Seleucids, by the Greeks. And now we have someone else using these same tactics. So we put all these ingredients together. Is it any wonder that Judas Maccabeus quickly becomes a hero in the minds of the Jews? So they began gathering these forces, they began starting this revolt, and naturally, the Seleucids start sending armies. The beauty of guerrilla warfare is that it doesn't matter how big of an army you send against guerrilla fighters, usually numbers don't do you much good. And such was the case in this revolt. Time after time, armies would be sent into the area of Judea, and time after time, little by little, parts of it would get picked off, supply trains would get taken down, cities would be ambushed. Judas actually was a remarkable strategist in many ways in terms of how he managed his forces. There was one time, for example, I don't have the video to show, it'd take too long anyway, but there's some interesting videos. If you're interested, I can send you a link to it later about this whole war. There was one time where there's this large army that comes in to try and weed out the Maccabees, and Judas knows he's not going to be able to face them on the field in a pitched battle. But they're coming to the city where he has made his camp momentarily. And so what he does is they send this big army in to attack him in the city. Well, he just abandons the city. And when the army comes into the city, he runs back behind them and attacks their camp. And so they take the city. Oh, well, I guess there's no rebels here. Come back and their camp has been completely sacked. It's just brilliant stuff like that. Very, very successful. Eventually, whatever reasoning might have been in his mind, he is able to take several areas, including Jerusalem, but eventually they do send some army, or a large army against him, and he decides to fight on the open field. Maybe he thought that they had figured out his guerrilla tactics by now. Maybe at this point, he has about 20,000 men. So maybe he thinks he genuinely has a chance. Maybe he got a little too cocky, who knows. But eventually, he does fight in the open field, and naturally, as you might expect, he loses. But guess what happens if you're fighting a guerrilla war, or at least a partial guerrilla war at this point, and you lose? Well, you just retreat back into the hills and keep going. After all, isn't that what we did in our revolution? We get beat in several pitched battles, and eventually you just still have all of these, militia members and patriots, and they keep on in the fight, even when the army has been lost. Think about, for example, Washington's defeat, where he has to retreat, and then eventually he crosses the Delaware, that famous crossing the Delaware. In fact, that's the painting that we have up there, right? Earlier. So that's how Judas conducts this war. In the process of all this, the main troublemaker, Antiochus IV, he gets called away to another invasion of another country, another part of his empire. And he contracts an illness and dies in the process of that. So now, all of a sudden, you start having political upheavals and everything. And bottom line, we're not going to go into all those details, it starts to take more and more pressure off of the Jews. Because all of a sudden, with the Seleucid Empire or Seleucid Kingdom in turmoil, they don't have as much time to deal with these rebels down in Jerusalem. And so eventually, you have some concessions being made. Now, there's still going to be a lot of fighting on and on and on for several years after that, but more and more what you see is the Maccabees actually successfully consolidating enough power to gain a degree of independence for a significant amount of time, actually, for several decades at least, from the Seleucids. Now, one other thing we need to mention. Oh, that's what I was trying to show. Yeah, this is the area that eventually they were able to kind of obtain and gain independence. You know, it's Jerusalem right in the center of it, but also an area around it, pretty sizable considering the amount of people they had and what they were able to accomplish against one of the main powers in that area of the world. But one other thing we want to mention in the process of what Judas was able to accomplish. In the midst of all this fighting, when some politics happens in the Seleucid Empire and the big army that was there has to leave, well, Judas is able to retake Jerusalem itself. And when he retakes Jerusalem, well, naturally, guess what one of his first priorities is as a Jew? The temple has been desecrated. So he's going to go in, he's going to cleanse the temple. So they go in, they remove the statue of Zeus, they remove the altar that has been defiled by the pig, they reconstruct, rebuild, cleanse everything. And in the process, one of the things that is to be done, especially during different festivals and just as a general practice in the temple according to the law, one of the things that's to be done is what we call the menorah now, the candlestick, that's supposed to be lit. And it's supposed to remain lit, especially during some of the different festivals that are established in the Jewish law. However, there had been so much conflict, so much combat, that there was only enough oil for one night for those candles to be lit, even though it was supposed to be lit for about a week. However, according to the historians, and we don't know exactly what all factors come into this, the lamps stayed burning for the required amount of time, the whole week, even though they technically only had oil for one night. Now, they claimed it was a miracle from God, a blessing for their efforts, all those kind of things. We don't have enough information to substantiate that. God would certainly be capable of doing something like that, but that also could very well be propaganda, because, of course, we don't have anything inspired written during this time. But nonetheless, this is also the origin of something. Have you ever heard of Hanukkah? We are now over 2,000 years past Judas Maccabeus' lifetime when he comes in and cleanses the temple from the Seleucid defilement. And yet, Jews still celebrate this event that we're talking about right now. If you didn't realize it, this ultimately is the event that Hanukkah is meant to celebrate. The cleansing of the temple and the lighting of this lamp that, again, according to the Maccabees, miraculously stayed lit for the set amount of time, those 8 days. So even today, the cultural significance for the Jewish people of what the Maccabees accomplished is huge. Even though they may not talk about it or we may not hear about it quite in that light. So now let's go back to what we've been discussing in the back of our minds, right? What effect has the American Revolution had on our society even to this day? Quick math quiz. How long ago was the American Revolution? Approximately. Round to the nearest 25 years, right? How long ago was the American Revolution? Do what? About 225, 250 years, again, depending on if you round up or down, but that's a substantial amount of time, right? And yet, things like the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, men like Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, Thomas Jefferson, stories like Revere's ride to say the British are coming, or Washington crossing the Delaware, those things, maybe not as much as they used to be, but still 250 years later, we still do talk about them. We still do think about them. They are still part of our cultural heritage. And that's 250 years later. Now think back to the fact that these events with the Maccabees, even the beginning of these events, was only 150 years before Christ. Are we beginning to put some of the pieces together? It is extremely important for us as we move into the time of Christ to realize just how significant this revolution was for the Jewish people. This was still very fresh on their minds, not in the sense that people 150 years later were still alive, from when that happened, but in the sense that this had changed their history completely. Judas Maccabeus, as well as his brothers and some others, their descendants at this time still had some sway in Jewish politics. Judas Maccabeus himself was possibly the greatest hero since King David in the minds of the Jews of that day. What he had done and the way he had done it was a model in their minds for what could be done again. Think about this. The Second Amendment in America. Why do we care so much about the Second Amendment? I'm not saying we should or shouldn't. I'm not getting into that argument at all, right? But why do we care so much about the Second Amendment? As a society, as a whole. Isn't the Second Amendment what potentially gives us the ability to revolt again if it became necessary? Isn't that why the Second Amendment was placed in the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, as we call them? To make sure that it was established in stone that this is a model, meaning the revolutionary model, this is a model that could be acted on again if necessary to prevent tyranny? Well, what do you think the Jews believed was appropriate if they ever came under a tyrannical rule again? Such as, Roman occupation. Well, obviously, their minds are going to go to what Judas Maccabeus did in freeing the Jews from the Seleucid occupation. We did it once. We can do it again. If it comes down to that, we're ready. And who do you think they expected to lead this revolution? As all the prophecies begin to unfold in such a way that if you trace books like Daniel, for example, you can figure out roughly, as a Jew living at this time, when the Messiah is supposed to appear. So who do you expect, or who do they expect to lead a revolution like Judas's? The Messiah. This is the blueprint they have in mind. This is what they're expecting. Their history, as it comes back that 150 years earlier to what the Maccabees accomplished, that is burned into their collective memory as a culture, as a society. No wonder they expected all this from Jesus. No wonder they expected all this about a physical kingdom. No wonder they expected all this about what he would do, how he would conduct himself. This is their heritage in their minds. This changes how we see their response, doesn't it? I hope it does. Because this is crucial to understanding why they reacted to Jesus the way they did. And not only that, as a Jew, reading the Gospels in particular, especially books like Matthew was geared more toward a Jewish audience, that's why I single it out. You're reading through the book of Matthew, you have Jesus, which by the way is the Greek equivalent of Joshua, hearkening back to another hero of Jewish history. And guess what one of his followers is named? Judas. Now, if you were a Jew reading that, what better way to envision what the Messiah is going to do than Joshua and Judas fighting side by side? Naturally, Joshua would have the seniority because he had the seniority in terms of being a more ancient hero, if you will, in their history. But that's what they're envisioning. As you begin reading the book of Matthew, or any of the Gospels really, as a Jew, that's what you expect to happen. And yet, who is Judas in the story? Oh, he's not the hero. He's the villain. You want to talk about a gut punch to everything that Jews expected. You want to talk about a very intentional subversion of everything they think the Messiah is going to be. You make the guy with the same name as your most recent hero, you make him the villain in the story. And see what happens. We're going to stop there. We have some more we're going to talk about the aftermath of the Maccabean revolt, especially as it pertains to the Romans getting involved in Jewish politics, as well as the origins of some of these groups like Pharisees and Sadducees. A lot of that background is going to continue to help us as we're building to the time of Jesus. But I hope tonight we can see, especially kind of comparing it to our own history and our own revolution, we can kind of begin to see just how significant these events were in the minds of a Jew as we move towards the birth of the Messiah, and as they begin to interact with him and recognize, wait a minute, he's not doing what he's supposed to here. He's not following the blueprint. What's going on? So again, this was, just as in our country 250 years ago, our defining revolution, because we really only had one, right, was our American Revolution. This was their defining revolution. It defined their culture in many ways for generations. It influenced every aspect of their society. And it's the model that's in their minds when the Messiah appears. So vital for us to pick up on this if we want to gain a deeper understanding of the dynamics that are in place when Jesus comes on the scene and begins to interact with the Jews. Any thoughts or comments before we wrap up for this evening? Well, as always, we do want to remind you the invitation of the Lord is open. We always are here to pray for, to encourage, to help one another. If there is a need that you would like to express this evening, we invite you to make it known as we stand and sing together.
This world is not my home,
I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond